Hello, it's Pastor Doug and my friend Greg. We're the Pilgrims of Plunder, and we're here to ramble for about an hour and hopefully occasionally be coherent. Today, we're going to talk about calling a pastor, and it's something I've pondered for a long time, but in particular now that I've started a new church, and I didn't think I'd ever in my life do that. And how do you go about finding the next pastor? Because how it's done in mainline churches, at least this day and age, I think is crazy. For those of you who have not grown up in the mainline church, let me explain it briefly. Usually, you have a council, which is the governing body of the church outside of the congregation, and they're usually made up of businessmen who take care of the important things of the church, i.e., the building and the money. Please note the sarcasm there. So they form then a subcommittee, a search committee, and you go find random people from the church, usually for diversity's sake. So we need an older person, we need a young person, we need the person's not too active. Maybe they'll bring it back to the church. And we'll put them on the committee, and they'll go out and find a pastor someplace from the ether, and it's completely capitalistic. The current pastor has nothing to do with this. As a matter of fact, forbidden to even get involved, and you have the blind leading the blind. I think that's crazy. I think it's absolutely insane. And now serving a church that's much more biblical, it has elders and deacons, and also pondering, I think one of the hardest transitions for a new church is the next guy. And also from a pastor's perspective, that's actually one of the scariest positions to go into. You're replacing the founding pastor. I've applied to positions like that, and it's like, wow, that's just terrifying. So, is there a better, more biblical way of doing this? And that's what I want to ponder today. Do you have any open comments before I continue to ramble, my friend?
Uh, yes. And yes, I will. I'm trying to think. I'm like, do I share it now? Will it be more appropriate later? Whatever. Um, I, I guess just by way of just personal expression on it, one of the things that I'm very grateful for was, boy, a few months ago now, having read through the Westminster Standards, which are their 5 articles, which includes the Directory of Public Worship, which addresses how Presbyterians engage in this activity. Real Presbyterians, not whatever American Presbyterians are. And then having followed up by reading the Savoy, which
Cambridge?
Sorry, Cambridge.
I get
Yes. I also read the Savoy, but no, what I mean
that.
is
That's
the
good too.
Cambridge, right? The Massachusetts, not England.
Yeah.
The Cambridge platform, which is the congregational system of not only everything, but this in particular. And the most I mean, like it seems so silly to say the most life-altering revelation is in their opening statement, which is how you want to lead a congregational statement, because the point of it was to contrast against the Presbyterian, in the fact that the Congregationalists were facing criticism from the Presbyterians. And the opening, the whole understanding of pastors. And I thought it was that life-altering point made that the churches existed before the elders existed, before the pastor. And that just totally blew my mind and changed everything.
Yep.
Because growing up in churches that are established, you have a pastor. I've never been in a church, and like there've been like the interim periods where you're looking, which is the things that we'll be discussing. But even in that, and you don't really realize what's going on. Congregationalism, which I firmly now believe is the most biblical system of church government, is again founded upon that easy to miss point of the first century churches. The apostles went through and appointed elders, but the churches already existed, which means a church can exist without a pastor, but a pastor cannot exist without a church. right? A
Yes.
pastor only exists because of his relationship to a flock,
Yeah.
which I say in very generic, broad terms, because if you go super hyper onto that, that has implications, which we can also, I maybe at
Yeah.
some point discuss at a later point. But to bring it back into the topic at hand about picking a pastor, I at least will be coming from, and you also being a congregationalist, coming from a congregational understanding of, you know, because even though you pointed out the capitalist approach, the corporate approach, which I also disagree with, at least it assumes, if you will, though it's more corporate than congregational, the church exists with or without the pastor,
Yep.
which is a very huge distinction,
Yep.
and has major implication when you start getting into denominational level discussions. Anyway, it was a really big deal, and it's still a really big deal. I haven't gotten over it. It was a great revelation. But anyway, that's
Oh, it
my
was too.
that's my
Because I
contribution.
remember when because the reference and in fact how I preached on Titus, because the first book I preached through at the new church was Titus, and it's clearly in there. You have a church,
Hmm.
and then you need elders.
Right.
In this case, the apostle gives Titus the authority to appoint elders. But the fact that there's a church there first.
Yep.
Now, obviously, a mature church will have good leadership,
Right.
and definitely it's very helpful to have a preacher and a pastor.
Right.
That's the ideal, no doubt about it.
Yep.
But you're absolutely right that the foundational level is the local church.
Right.
But the question for today is, how does the local church go about finding a pastor in the 21st century?
Well,
And,
see, and
and
if you're
because it,
Presbyterian, this is easy. You don't. The
well,
presbytery will take care of it
they
for
don't
you.
do that though. But the modern Presbyterians do it like the old Congregationalists,
Right. Right. Right.
because I mean, I mean, you don't have the presbytery saying, "Here's your pastor."
Hmm.
In the end, I mean, for the modern Presbyterian system, it's a hybrid of the system, or it's really the old congregational system. You need a new pastor. You go out and you go within the presbytery. So you have
Right.
to, if someone who's been approved, has been tested, and has the the imperator stamped upon them from the Catholic small c church,
Hmm.
and then who you call, you have freedom.
Right.
Now, I know non-Presbyterian churches can call pastors what's called out of bounds. I know I've told the elders of the church, if I'm called home to glory, tomorrow, you need to go to a solid Presbyterian denomination and ask for them to give you pastors,
Right.
or at least a list of pastors, and they can be called out of bounds. I don't know if the reverse can be true. I have doubts about that. So, like, could a PCA church call me, who has no standing in the
Oh,
presbytery?
okay. Right. Right.
I got a feeling that would be that would be no bueno. I
That's a
think
big
that would,
no-no.
yeah. I'll ask my PCA friends. I've never thought of that question. That'd be a great question to ask them,
Right.
because in the end, though, the only thing the presbytery or the General Assembly, the big picture, can do is they can say you're no longer PCA.
Right.
We remove your title from you and your affiliation. They can't, at least in old school, come and roll in and take over.
Right.
They can't say, no, this guy's not your pastor. This new guy is your pastor. Deal with it.
Right.
So I agree with the congregational method, that older method, that I think finding a pastor personally, and this is where some of the parts I want to get into the debate about, I think it's the primary job of the elder board,
Okay.
because the elders are the ones who are the older men who are the most knowledgeable about the faith,
Hmm.
who are capable of teaching and preaching, and they should go and find the next pastor. Now, if they want to include some other folks on a subcommittee, search committee, fine, but it should be elder led.
Right.
But the advantage of the denomination is you're going within your framework, and at least they have some approval. Because in the old school, what's called a vicinage council is you go to the denomination and you ask for, give us a list of approved people. Here's your list. They call that particular person, but before they're officially ordained or installed, the local churches, the presbytery as it were, come by and examine him and then they give their blessing or not up to the local church, and the local church can ignore it, but at least you're bringing in people who have some real knowledge, strong knowledge of theology. So first it's the elders, which should hopefully know their scriptures, but then the regional clergy are coming in to have some discernment whether this person will fit in this church or not. And it's done so it's the local have the final say, but there's a real Catholic aspect of it too. But because of the ravages of liberalism, it's a meaningless system now. It really is the blind leading the blind. So I think, I mean, does that sound appropriate to you?
Yeah, yeah. And yes, yeah, and like two points on that. One of which is that matter of charity, which I loved, and it's also in the Cambridge that if there is a church that has more than one pastor, a
Yeah.
qualified pastor elder, that and a church in the area that does not, for whatever reason, illness, death, absence, whatever, that they are encouraged to loan out a
Yep.
pastor. Which I think is also something that's very beautiful, because one of those things that you do end up with, and I don't know, maybe debatable whether it's out of necessity or something less justifiable, when you don't have a pastor, just like other kind of random people fill in periodically during that pastor's absence. And I think it is, again, like you talking about, like you actually have within that framework, you already know that these people are going to be, of your, the same orthodoxy, um, that a church would loan a pastor out as an interim pastor, I think is very good. If again that congregation doesn't have qualified preaching elders, because you may have very good teaching and ruling elders, but maybe they're not really really good at preaching, or capable or able to for any
Yeah.
extended period of time. And yes, I agree with it should be primarily elder led, if not exclusively elder, as far as choosing the next pastor, internally or externally. And I know that there's a lot of, I don't know, people get nervous about things like that, which I guess is sort of that whole form a subcommittee and make sure everybody has a say, something, which ultimately the congregation has
They get the final vote.
the
Yes,
final say.
absolutely.
But like if you if you don't trust your elders to pick a pastor, you have bigger problems already.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's one of those weird things that come up as soon as anybody starts talking about, the authority of the elders. And then like people in the congregation get kind of squeamish. And I'm like, have you no faith in God of
Yeah.
your appointed leaders?
Yeah.
Because if you don't, is there already a legitimate issue you should be addressing? Because you should be able to comfortably and in rest say, well, of course the elders are going to pick the next pastor. That's great. um if you have problems with that, there are probably already bigger problems. But no, I agree with that as well. Yeah, that whole mandated diversity subcommittee thing, it just, again, it makes no biblical sense because
Right.
there's no biblical justification for it. That is totally a modern
Yeah. Because you
practice.
have people who don't care about biblical doctrine. They
Right.
really care about liberalism, and liberalism is you can believe anything you want.
Hmm.
So, is he a nice guy? Is he friendly? Do I like his family?
Right.
As opposed to no, doctrine and dogma is the main concern.
Right.
Because again, the pastor for the liberal church, the pastor's main purpose is not to teach. He's the teaching and preaching elder, and that huge problem.
Hmm.
So, I have just a quick note. You said there's the preaching elder and then the ruling teaching elders. I always thought it was preaching and teaching elder and then ruling elders.
There's a um
Or that's
the
the modern
Cambridge
Presbyterian.
the Cambridge has three distinct elders.
Well, yeah, because they they,
The
they make a
teaching and
teaching
preaching are
elder for the
mentioned in the
colleges.
same article.
Yeah,
The ruling is in
yeah,
its own article. the teaching and preaching are similar, and I think
They
and I
say it
agree
might
with
be.
I agree
Yeah.
with your view on it, that one of the primary reasons why the teaching elder is distinct in the Cambridge is because if you're establishing
Yeah.
educational
Yeah.
organizations, a
Yeah.
university, for example, you'd have a teaching elder. He's not a preacher, he's not a
Yeah.
pastor.
Yep.
But yes, I would say in almost all cases now, for the most part, mostly due to congregation size as well,
Yeah.
your preaching elder, the pastor, is also your teaching elder.
Yep.
But that you would have a distinction between the two, I have no problem with.
Yeah.
It's one of those, every preaching elder ought to be a teaching elder, but not every teaching elder ought to be a preaching elder. You can have
Fair.
someone who manages, if you will, the education of the church, Sunday school,
Yeah.
Bible study, so on and so forth. He needn't be a preacher. Because teaching, though preaching is teaching, not all
Yep.
teaching is preaching. As we've talked
Exactly.
about before, a lecture, which is of wonderful and great benefit, is very different than a sermon. So
Yep.
you wouldn't want to teach the congregation on Sunday
Yep.
morning. You want to preach to the congregation on Sunday morning, and that's a different role or a different skill set.
So the question I have mostly for this, and this is the part I don't know what the answer is, I'm debating, is assuming the pastor is in good standing,
Mhm.
should he be involved in the search committee? Because by current church
Oh,
culture,
right. Okay. Good standing
the
with
answer,
his own
yeah,
congregation. Okay.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Well, obviously, if there's something wrong, then
Right. If
no,
he's
then
under
he,
discipline, which is
yeah,
why you're replacing him,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
his input's probably not not a
yeah,
good
yeah.
thing. Right. Okay.
Um, so, but so because our current culture is no, the pastor has nothing to do with finding the next pastor.
Right.
And I don't know where that's in the Bible.
Right.
That seems to be foolish. I'm trying to think of some reasons for that. And also, I was wondering, especially for a small and medium-sized church, and I've been wondering about this. Let's say the church grows here at TRC and, they'll still somewhat healthy 10 years, 15, 20 years from now. Would it be appropriate to say, okay, we're going to go find the next pastor, but I'll step back. I'll be part of that search committee, but we'll bring him in for a period of time for a couple years, and he'll be the associate pastor. Like he might be actually paid full time because, he probably young guy probably needs the money, and I'll go part time, but we'll see if it works out. And as it seems to be more and more working out, I step away more and more. Is that appropriate? Because the current model is, again, not only does the pastor have nothing to do with it, I'm supposed to disappear. And I understand in one sense the logic of that. Because let's like again, because I'm let's say I again 20 years from now, and I step down from TRC and the Lord has shown mercy and it's grown. To have the new guy show up and have the old guy there, that's hard because everyone's going to be going to the old guy, look to the old guy. So does he step away? I mean, like I go find a new church. Again, I'm not sure any of this is in the Bible. Wouldn't it be better, again, what I've been pondering is you bring him in and then slowly step away and train and train him up and have the congregation get used to him. And also, if it's just a bad fit, then you can try it again. And the other thing I worry about, like I said, replacing the founding pastor is particularly terrifying if
Right.
you're a new pastor. And that just simply makes sense. So I can't cite scriptures directly, but I think what I'm suggesting has more of a flavor of scripture and less a
It's
business model. But what do you think about that?
I think it's a great question. So all right.
That's such a politically correct answer. I love
No,
it.
no, 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 it is.
No,
It
no,
is.
no, you were being bad. You weren't being bad, but it just,
It,
yeah, yeah, you have to
because
ponder it.
it does, it brings up a lot, and again, as we should
Yeah,
go to scripture on it. And so I'm trying to also think of situations. So I don't believe in any way, unless there's something that, which is very possible that something that subtle that I missed, which is the answer to everything. I don't know that we would find an answer in the New Testament. The New Testament record of the church doesn't extend long enough for us to really have a lot of examples of turnover.
Yeah.
So there's kind of that. Like, you only really have first generation church.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of second generation issues in scripture. Now, that's the New Testament church, but because being a good, well, I guess Orthodox Christian, the church has existed since Adam, so we have plenty of examples of turnover in the church.
Moses,
And
Aaron.
and so what I'm trying to think of, because a lot of those instances were divine, God said, "This is who's in charge."
Yeah.
And and there was people question it every now and then, and it didn't work out for them. So we obviously have divine appointment. You have replacement, do field promotion, right? The guy above you dies, and
Yep.
he's dead, you're the next in line, sort of a thing. And that happened in both the time of the patriarchs, and then obviously you see that clearly in the line of kings, because that's how royal lines generally were done, unless the invader shows up and tells you this is your next king, still from that same line, because you have to respect the royal line. But I'm trying to think of,
Moses and Aaron. Would that be the closest?
but Moses, they were
You run.
both, I don't know what's your example with that, because they were both
But
Levites.
see, the Old
No, but that's the
Testament is
thing.
hard
Aaron was,
unless you go priest, because kings don't work.
no, kings
Because
do not work, but Aaron was a high priest. Moses was not.
yeah.
Aaron was the Aaronic line of priests. He is the,
Wow, Doug, Bible
okay,
fail.
next.
Moses and Joshua tried this
Right, but
again.
Moses died. Well,
Yeah.
yes, Moses died. Joshua replaced because of death. I think we do have in the Old Testament the aging, and I guess even just sort of in general. So to be a priest, you have to be 30 years old. Your service in the actual temple duties is between 30 and 50. At 50, you retire and you cease doing the same labors, but you continue on as a Levitical priest. So that you have the previous generation of priests around is still very biblical. Like, you didn't execute them at 50. We aren't Vikings. You don't shove them off on a little boat because they're old now. So I
Say like Jethro with elders, but that's not replacement. That's help.
right.
Um,
You have, I mean, and again, it's not in the same church, but you have Paul instructing Timothy, the elder pastor instructing and teaching the younger pastor. But that's there. I mean, again, that's different. You do have a part of the instruction, though, that the older men are to instruct the younger men. You can model that even among the elders themselves, that the older pastor of his congregation is to teach and instruct his younger replacement. I don't see that being any violation. And honestly, and though it's not an invalid concern, the social awkwardness, if you will, of you're the new guy and the old guy is still there. I think that a lot of cause for that social awkwardness is arrogance, pride, and hubris, right?
Yeah.
You should, as a pastor, as a Christian, be meek and should thank God that you have this wealth of knowledge and experience, not only in the faith, but specifically to this congregation, because though the congregation may be still going to the older pastor, what a blessing it is as the new pastor to have that same man there to go to when you need help on how to care for his flock that he is entrusting to you. Because isn't that what all the elders, I guess even going to Timothy for the quick conclusion of my rant, the pastors appointed to these congregations were appointed by the apostles. Who did the pastors go to? Well, they go to the apostles, the establishing authority of, they went and planted these churches. If you have questions on theology or even on your congregation, who would you ask? Well, how about the guy who set it all up? So I think that it would be quite a blessing to have the previous guy for your congregation specifically.
Yeah.
I know that at least in your no, in your previous congregation, um, having there was Bob Ensminger, who had been in that church for forever. And
Yeah.
anytime anybody had a question, who do you go to?
Yeah.
You go to Bob because he knows all the answers. Like what an amazing blessing it is to
Yeah.
have an elder of the church. Anyway, so I don't know if that did
You
anything.
know, and
I'm thinking it through.
I think the fear of the pastor being involved really comes from a modern liberal business mentality of the church. Because I've run into in old mainline liberal churches where I've as a younger pastor, I was told by some of the elders, it's like, look, my grandfather founded this church. We're in charge of the church. They don't use this term, but essentially you're a cake topper.
Right.
And there's almost like this tension. You don't want the pastor to having too much authority and too much power. Now,
Right.
and there's a little bit of truth to that if you get some cult figure or something like that.
Sure, sure.
And then the elders in the congregation have to stand up. I mean, the pastor can go bad, the elders can go bad, and the church can go bad because of
Yep.
sin.
Yep.
But there's much more, even within I think, congregationalism, which is biblical, there is a more hierarchy to the New Testament there than we like to think in
Hmm.
our modern, very modern, individualistic capitalist way.
Right.
And so I the notion, I can't think of a reason why the pastor should not be on some level involved in finding the next pastor.
Right.
Though it's universally in the modern church not done. I mean, am I wrong? But in modern fundamentalist conservative Baptist churches, which are congregationally governed, I know there was one church here in the area. It was founded by one guy, and he was there for decades. It went well,
Hmm.
and they brought in the new guy, and he was there only for a few months. And I don't know the details, but my sense is probably it's fault on both. But but again, it's really hard because he's not the new guy. Should, instead of stepping away, should that founding pastor said, no, I'm going to guide the process. I'm going to shepherd the process. I'm going to pastor the process.
Right.
But let me ask, you've been in fundy Baptist churches. You're in a conservative Baptist church
Hmm.
currently, though I think your pastor is the founding pastor,
Yes.
Watts, right?
Yes. 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 Pastor
So,
Claude is the
yeah.
founding pastor
So
of Reformata.
how do conservative Baptist churches usually do this?
I have no idea. I never went through it.
Okay. I think, I
In either
believe,
one, the IFB church that I belong to in Connecticut, it
yeah, yeah.
was always I actually I believe he's still the pastor of the church now.
Wow.
So I have no idea. And then in this one, of course, with Pastor Claude, he's the founding pastor and by God's grace, still with us now. So,
Right.
and will
Right.
continue to be so for a long
Right.
time to come. So no, I've never gone through it. We have it in writing how it gets handled for our church and our constitution. But that's it. I've never uh actually
Because
experienced it.
I think, and I'll ask my Baptist wife, but I've seen other Baptist churches go through it. I think it's again, I'm calling it the modern business model. So, the minister like says, you know what, I'm retiring in a year or two. You guys go find the new pastor. Yeah, I mean, I might be around a little bit for counseling unofficially, on the process, but I'm not part of the process. I'm actually pretty sure that's how fundamentalist Baptist churches do it, or at least conservative Baptist churches. And he's not part of the process.
Right.
And now, obviously in a conservative Baptist church, you're gonna have more healthy elders and so on and so forth.
Right.
But again, hopefully the person who knows the church the best and knows the job the best is actually that local pastor. Why not?
Right.
And also, and why not have a period of transition?
Mm-hmm.
Now, now again, like with the, for myself, if it's assuming the guy coming in is going to be younger, because why would you have someone old like
Well,
me, especially
right.
20 years later? Um, and so like, okay, he needs to get the full-time wage because he has probably a family and kids.
Hmm.
I'm on retirement thing, so cut my pay way back,
Right.
and I'll start stepping back, but I'm still around to help out. I mean, if I was a younger pastor, I think I would actually like that. But I think for some pastors, it's like, no, no, this is a new administration. Again, there's always secular examples. Like, you don't, if President Trump becomes the next president, you
Hmm.
have a clear break.
Right.
But historically, to be blunt, by the second century, you get bishops.
Right.
So you very much have a hierarchical approach in the church.
Right.
And though I think your point is excellent, though I think the New Testament teaches that congregationalism, that assembly, it soon goes Episcopal very quickly.
Right.
So we don't have a clear biblical example. And note, by the way, there's some freedom on this. If the
Right.
local
It's
church
not
wants
in
to,
scripture, so
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, like, if you want to do the search committee, if long as it's done with godly men, fine.
Hmm.
If you want to have the pastor involved, I can't see any commandment against it, fine.
Right.
But just, I guess, on a selfish level, thinking about the church I serve and also in general, you know, is it wrong for me to insert myself into the process?
Right.
Assuming the elders in the congregation give their blessing.
Right.
Because
No,
the
I
answer,
don't.
no, so quickly, the answer is no, that's bad. I'm like, okay, why?
Right.
Where's that bad? I don't know.
I don't know. I can only think of it again, that with presumptuous sin.
Yeah.
Um, to presume that if you have the current pastor involved in the process, that somehow, I don't know, his contribution is going to be detrimental to the process, or
Sure.
even, and again,
How?
also more presumption. Well, maybe the new guy will be uncomfortable, and we don't want him to be, so we'll remove, the current pastor beforehand out of. I don't know.
Well, all the examples that come to mind, whether it's the military, whether it's in school systems, whether it's business, the old administration, you have a clear break. But again, none of that's biblical.
No, and
And
there's
it's,
even a turnover for a lot of that stuff, but there's a
yeah,
turnover period. So, like for the military, if command changes,
yeah,
other than, field promotion,
yeah,
there is a turnover period. You have a handoff. They don't always go super well because, again, the military is nothing but politicians with guns. So it's all still politics. It is really what it comes down to. It's
fair
all
enough.
it's all politics anyway. So um and even in the change of civil administrations, of the
Yeah,
federal or state government, you have
yeah, true.
a turnover period.
Yeah,
Um Now the one coming in has authority. The one leaving is there to, here's all the stuff that we found, what we're working on, so on and so forth. Um I think the greatest issue, and this is a very personally, and I understand it. It's a matter of human weakness and sin. When you're the new pastor coming in, your concern should be primarily for the flock. It's not, and I think this is where a lot of that first article of the Cambridge helps with me on this. It's not your church. It's not even the founding pastor's church. It's
right.
Christ's church.
King.
You are to go in with them in mind. You're
Yeah,
not to roll up the way that the Gentile does, lording their position. It's
yeah,
not now your church for you to restructure and reorganize and to, I don't like this, I'm going to change this, and I got to wait for the new guy to take off before I can implement. Why is he doing it this way? That's stupid. I'm going to do it my way. You don't go into the church with that mentality, but that's what we do because we're fallen, sinful men. You go into the church with the church in mind, and you go in with a gentleness and with a humility, and if you go into it with a selfless love and meekness, the fact that, again, the fact that the existing pastor is there is a great blessing. He's not a
And
threat because you're not a threat to him, because it's not his church and it's not your church. It's
and
for
and,
the
and
sheep.
yeah, and this is why I think denominations and having a clear confessional tradition and having a focus that the main job of the minister is preaching and teaching really makes sense.
Right.
Because if those things are unimportant, then yeah, it's okay. It's X's church now. It's my church,
Yep.
and we're going to do things differently because this is the next
Do things
generation
my
in the
way.
business. Yeah, because yeah, I mean, the the founding of Ford Motor Company's left, and now I'm going to come in and we're going to run the. It's about being successful,
Yep.
and and especially if you have a very weak theological tradition. Well, the old pastor put an emphasis on this. I'm going to put an emphasis on this on B,
Mhm.
and it's a real problem. As opposed to if you have a clear theological tradition, you have a clear understanding of who you are,
Right.
then there shouldn't hopefully be much of a change.
Right.
There's a beautiful continuity. And so again, it seems to argue, I mean, it seems, and especially in the case of TRC, where there is no tradition. I mean, there is no denomination because
Right.
Congregationalism is dead.
Right.
And
Yeah.
unfortunately, a lot of conservative Presbyterians are pretty squishy with a lot of diversity in the bad sense. I think it makes sense to have actually the pastor be involved in the system.
Yep.
And, is it, I was thinking of, thinking of an analogy, is it more like a family thing where, as I get older and older and older, and, my daughter marries, and I go, eventually go live at her husband's house, I'm now under his authority.
Right.
And again, maybe less of a transit, maybe the problem is you're not a transition, but is there a transition where it's like, okay, I'm the part-time senior pastor, you're the full-time associate pastor, but once this is clearly working out after, half a year, 2 years maybe, okay, you know what? I'm no longer the pastor. You're the pastor. I'm just a parishioner.
Hmm.
Now, I am an old guy that, you respect your elders,
Right.
but part of being an elder is now I got to know my place now. Back to my family analogy. My daughter's husband is now the head of the household.
Hmm.
I need to show him respect that he has in the end that authority, as
Right.
he shows respect for me for my oldness.
Right. Yes, your
So
oldness.
my
Uh,
oldness.
it's an
So
interesting it's an interesting analogy though, the family
yeah.
one, because also he should only be your son-in-law because you had vetted and approved of it beforehand.
Yep. Yep.
Right? So you should have had input into your future head, if you will,
Yeah.
even in that, because yes, I agree. If you are now living under his care in his household, he is the authority of that.
Yep.
But you would have already vetted him. As if
Yep.
not, then you would not have, and to use the old correct term, you would not have given your daughter to him in
Uh-huh.
marriage, to totally be
Yep.
handmaiden's tale.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. 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 Yep.
women are not autonomous. Young girls are under their father's headship and authority, and then when they become women, they are under their husband's headship and authority. They are never under their own headship. So you would have already given your daughter to him. And that would have been a very different process. So, kind of running that parallel,
Yeah.
your sheep are under your authority, by God, and you, by his mercy as well, are able to give your flock over to the next shepherd. And you may become a sheep in that flock as well, because that's another scenario. What if you do get to the point of oldness where you are no longer like
Yeah.
able to pastor the flock? What a beautiful thing to still have fellowship with that particular
Yeah.
local congregation now as a congregant under new pastoral care.
Yeah. And I don't have to go and like forsake the local assembly
Right.
and
But you
go
better move
find
out
some
of
Lutheran
state now.
church.
It's
I mean,
like,
and to
why?
go find some, yeah, go find some Lutheran church to hang out for what, a year or two, and then I can come back from exile.
Right. Right.
I
A
mean,
retirement community church.
yeah,
You're gonna be like, all right, I'll go to the Florida denomination now.
right, right. So, oh, oh, by the way, sorry, off on a tangent. One of the things that frustrates me so much, so many older ministers I have met, and including evangelical ones, who once they retire stop going to church.
Right.
I'm like, are you kidding me? I mean, like,
Right.
wait, what? It's like, so that's all from another episode.
Hmm.
But I've seen that happen all too often. Um, because I think, part of the job of the pastor is to prepare for the next guy. And I've seen terrifying examples where they'll have a evangelical Bible preaching pastor being there for decades. He just completely steps aside. They do the silly search committee of randomness, and then they get some person who actually is a liberal and doesn't believe, or
Right.
at least doesn't believe what he was preaching. And I'm like, huh.
Hmm.
And because I think in that case, he's done a poor job.
Right.
Because if part of shepherding and guiding the household of God isn't part of the job to prepare for the future when you're not there.
Right. Right.
So is the family analogy maybe the best analogy?
Right.
I become your father, I mean, to quote Paul.
I think it works well. With that, I definitely think there's a lot of parallels of wisdom for it, of course.
Yeah.
Also, for as much as there is a distinction in the preaching elder, he's still an elder. And as we led with, it is the elders that ought to select the next pastor. You don't
Yeah.
suddenly disqualify your current pastor from being an elder, right? Is he not an elder who is uh who should have a point, or a part and input into selecting the next pastor, because he's an elder, not because he's the pastor, but
Yeah.
because he's an elder. He's still a qualified elder of the church. Why wouldn't like, why would you exclude, barring church discipline, why would you exclude one of your elders from being able to select the next pastor? Right. So, which is kind of an interesting point. Does he retain, is he still an elder with the new pastor? But I mean, I guess there's freedom on that.
I think there's a freedom that I probably wouldn't. Like I said, I'm not dogmatic about any of
Turn
this.
it
I'm
over
really
to the next generation.
yeah, I'm thinking
Right.
I think again, I retain the senior pastor title, and I go part-time.
Right.
Once there's a sense, like, because I mean, you really don't know the congregation and you don't know the guy until after several months,
Sure.
no matter how closely you vet. And there's some weird things where you can have a really good congregation and a really good pastor, and they just don't fit.
Right. Oh yeah.
And
No,
they
no, no.
just,
Of course.
yeah,
Absolutely.
they,
Yep.
the fit's not there,
Yep.
as you've pointed out. In the Cambridge, each congregation is different depending on location and people,
Yep.
and you need to have that good fit.
Right.
So, and so okay, the fits well. I'm now going to step aside. I would probably step down totally, and probably at the time I'm probably also tired, and
You'll want to.
yeah, yeah. And also,
Right.
that's always been one of my fantasies, to have the authority but no responsibility.
Uh-huh.
Yay.
That's a good make
Yeah,
believe
I'm
scenario.
the grandparent who I can give the kids all the sugar I want and give them money and send them home.
All
And the
authority and
parents
no
can deal with discipline.
responsibility. I mean, you
Absolutely.
should
Yeah.
just be a politician in the federal level.
Absolutely. But there's a
You
place
can make
again.
all the decisions and not have to deal with any of the consequences
Yeah,
personally.
yeah, but yeah, absolutely. Again,
America.
half joking, but yeah, there's a place for grandparents. You know, so I think there's a wisdom, and then you step aside, and to me, I would step down from elder board. I personally would.
Sure.
He's now the head,
Right.
and I assume his other elders there, and I'm just going to be a parishioner.
Right.
and I'm gonna be the little guy with the cane putzing around, and awesome. Um, that to me seems to be a much more biblical method.
Right.
But again, it's going against tradition, and
Right.
even in very conservative circles, because the vast majority, the pastor's just not involved. I mean, again, I'm pretty sure I asked my wife this, and fundamentalist conservative Baptist churches, oh no, you don't do that.
Right.
And we've joked around that once I step down, I disappear.
Right.
I'm like, I'm part of my mind like, why?
Right. There's the other scenario which I think lends itself to a good outcome, which is your replacement is already in your congregation.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not
Oh yeah,
necessarily the
absolutely. Yeah,
specific of the question, because it was, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
because as
yeah.
we
Please.
started with, can you, you know, uh, the advantage of having a denomination is you have a pool from which to draw another pastor. The other scenario, of course, which I think is a wonderful blessing for the local congregation, is that your next pastor is or has already been an elder in that church. A younger elder, or somebody in that congregation. Now, I do understand to that, and again, not to make things matters of logistics, um, like you shouldn't necessarily be targeting by age, though there is a matter of prudence in your next elders, as much as they should be old, you want older men to be elders.
Yeah.
Um, having young old elders, 30, if we say 30, if you have elders who are in their 30s when you are near your retirement age, then what a blessing that is to draw from one of your own elders to be the next pastor, because now there already is that natural affection in addition to the divine affection of the saints. So your elder loves the congregation already because it's his body, to which he already belongs. And I would say, again, hopefully there would be no real issues between him and you, the outgoing pastor, because you would have already been living with and working with one another in the church for a number of years.
Yeah, and he gets to know the congregation. The congregation gets to know you, and I agree with you. And thank you for bringing this up, because I've thought about that too. It would be epic if you grew some up within the church.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say, I I got some thoughts. I have a younger deacon who becomes an elder and has the gifts of being a pastor. Gets some formal training.
Mm-hmm.
Not do you have to have an MDiv in this day and age? I'd say no, but some formal training would be nice. And then to have that within the church, that would be beautiful. To
Mm-hmm.
to go from being a young deacon to younger elder to then being a pastor. um, it's interesting because I know the other way the old system was supposed to work is you have a pastor and an associate pastor, let's say in a bigger church. But I've hardly ever seen the associate pastor become the pastor.
Right.
That's how that like almost never happens. And again, I think it's a marketing thing. But I have two verses as we get closer to the end here. I'll go
Sure.
like 15 minutes. Um, two verses. First Corinthians 3 about about the importance of correct doctrine, and First Corinthians 3:8. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, but each will receive his own reward according to his own labor. Now um obviously God is one who plants, God is the one who waters, but is there not a building up on this structure implied in that verse? The other one, and it's where the Presbyterians get their crazy line, nursing fathers, which when you first heard it was like kind of creepy. But they're going with Numbers 11, 11, 12. But let me start with 11. So Numbers 11, 11. So Moses said to the Lord, why have you been so hard on your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you have laid the burden of all these people on me? Verse 12. Was it Was it I who conceived all this people? Was it I who brought them forth? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carrying a nursing infant, the land which you swore to their fathers. And so, well, let me keep it running. Where am I to get meat to give to all these people? For they weep before me, saying, give us meat that they may eat. I alone am not able to carry this burden because it is too burdensome for me. And then you have the assistance of the 70 elders. But that, again, that family image. Now, I wouldn't want to push it too far, but is there some scriptural justification for this? What do you think?
Um, I so for the first one, the First Corinthians text. Yes, and the First Corinthians text is very interesting because again, it is that matter of, who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers by whom ye
Yeah.
believed, even as the Lord gave to every man. I have planted, Paul, Apollos watered, but
Yep.
God gave the increase. So, I mean, by this you have Paul, literally, figuratively, planting the church.
Yeah.
Apollos being the waterer, I assume then, as far as just a chronologic record, Apollos came after Paul
Yeah.
and was a preacher for that congregation, if you will, for however much time. Um, and and so and that's a good structure because again, boy, because there's a lot of history with that, which we actually have record on, as far as Apollos traveling and learning, traveling with and learning from Paul. I think I don't remember Apollus's background or history.
Well, he needed extra training.
He did, yeah. He went with he was under what's it? Yeah, they found him. He was preaching in a synagogue, right? Was that Apollos? I don't remember. I may be thinking of a different person. Anyway, um, is that I mean there is a
It's well, I mean, 1 Corinthians 6:12, but concerning Apollos, our brother, I encouraged him greatly to come to you with the brethren. So
right.
there's some level um that Apollos was trained.
Right.
Um, was he under Priscilla and Aquila?
That was
Yeah.
Priscilla and Aquila. Yeah, he was because
Yeah,
he was a
Acts, yeah, it is Acts 18.
yes. All right, I'm
Yeah.
remembering it correctly. He was a disciple of John the Baptist, I think is what it was, and he was preaching in the
He was
synagogues.
he was eloquent and
Right.
skilled in the scriptures, but needed more theological time to cook.
Right. And so
So,
Priscilla and Aquila instructed him. And so then yes. And to that, and I kind of want to just quickly comment because you had pointed out, is it good or should a pastor have formal training? Um, I I being of a different mindset, I don't disagree
yes.
with you, but my definition of formal is different. I am a tradesman, and tradesmen have formal education, but on the job, right? So a tradesman learns in an apprenticeship, not necessarily in a classroom. So, should a pastor have formal training? Yes. How do you define formal? If you are taught by another pastor theologically and how to be a pastor, because arguably the best teachers of being a preacher would be a preacher. Spurgeon, for example, taught pastors how to be pastors, right? He didn't just teach theology, he taught how to preach. Um, Now, he did so, of course, in a formalized academic setting. But if you have a pastor who is teaching you how to be a pastor in an apprenticeship, if you will, more of that structure, I think that is um, uh, perfectly valid as far as formal education. Um,
I slightly disagree. I don't I agree the current system we have, you go to a very liberal seminary and that's all you need.
mhm.
That's problematic, but there's a reason why the Puritans created Yale and Harvard.
Yep.
Um, because I think obviously the ideal is both. That you have some mentorship. And I had mentors, but never in the church I might be serving. And I think it would be amazing if you had mentorship in the church you're going to be serving, But also, being a pastor is not fully a tradesman. There is an academic component to it, and there is a place for that academic training. Do you have to technically have an MDiv degree? I would say no. I don't know where that's literally in scripture. Maybe do a whole episode on this one. But I know, like, I've had friends who want to become a Presbyterian minister, and they're like, no, no, you need the academic degree and other stuff.
Sure. And that's a
And
denominational call. A
yeah,
congregation can
exactly.
make
And
that
I think
call. Sure.
there's a freedom to that. I do think there's a wisdom to having some academic background, that
Yeah.
you've spent the time in the classroom
Some
reading the
good academic
books.
background.
You know, exactly. No, I agree with that. But that is not devoid of the church. And I think it's been a disaster that the church has turned over the school system onto itself.
Sure. Right.
Again, back to that original conversation about, teaching elders, which they were in charge of the school,
Right.
and the elders controlled the church and the school. And it's been a disaster to let it just go randomly onto itself. And that I agree with. I to use the crash analogy. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Right.
So,
Right. No, I
um,
agree.
yeah.
And there is, to your point, there is a great advantage of having formalized education and training. It can help with a lot of things that can be mislearned or, I guess crudely put, messed up. And yes, the Puritans and generations of the church gone by had much higher standards for the training of a pastor. And I get that. I mean, again, because being a what?
Keep it going.
Okay. Being a pastor is very important and should not be taken lightly. I think even from a purely academic standpoint, but this again, and this is a totally different argument or a totally different discussion, but I still want to sort of bring it up without fully
Yeah.
derailing.
Yeah.
Academic institutions were great because they were the only places where that information could exist. Resources, educated men with very limited physical resources, books, sort of a thing. You had to consolidate them logistically in order to then be able to teach. We now have digital everything. So one of my points that I bring up, and I think is, if you will, a defense for, but not exclusive to no matter what translation, no matter what English translation you use, at some point somebody had to decide what word to use to translate it into whatever language. We'll use English. It's a valid translation. However, the Hebrew or the Greek may have subtleties, but you have to pick one. Now, you could go to different translations and get different versions, if you will, on that, all of which are valid. Certain ones may have different implications. This is just a natural limitation of how a translation works. An advantage of knowing Hebrew and Greek and even Latin, these were requirements that used to exist for being a pastor, is that when you go to prepare to preach and teach, you can read the original language and then expound upon it in a way more beneficial to your congregation than just the simple reading of one English translation, right? You can do a better job teaching. Now, that only used to be accomplished in an academic setting, learning how to do that, having those resources. Now, and again, not that it justifies anything, you give Logos enough money, you're going to have software that will break down everything, right? You don't have to know Greek or Hebrew, and you can deep dive into a particular text and have no formal education and still provide an incredibly academic sermon. Now, that's one example, and I'm just bringing it up because this is, again, college is great, secular and religious. College is great for certain reasons. I don't think that it is as great as it once was because it's not as necessary as it once was, as far as an access to information and instruction.
Every Greek and Hebrew teacher I've ever known would be screaming at you for the.
That's fine. I also say that nobody needs to learn.
I'm not saying you're wrong, but there is a difference one of the actually I put in the sermon last week. One of the rookie mistakes most pastors do make is I've had 1 year of Greek or Hebrew, and therefore I can be an expert, and they make so many basic mistakes. Just to give you one example, just
Sure.
off on a tangent, one of the most common rookie mistakes is you are like, okay, I know this now Greek word for this word or phrase. I go look it up in a lexicon. I can now interchange any word I want in for it because
Right.
I can read a Greek lexicon. And
Right.
of course, that is not how language works.
No, no,
The
of course not.
lexical domain is critical, just off on a tangent.
Yep.
But I would agree with you. I mean, I'm a little more pro education, pro
I know.
college than you. But
Yes,
I
yes, you
don't think
are.
I don't think we're too far apart.
No.
I mean, let's say for instance, I had a young elder in this church who, because of prophetic utterances, we would think he'd make a good pastor.
Right.
You need to go and quit your job, go get a 4 year bachelor's degree and get a 3 years MDiv degree. Nah.
Right.
I mean, you don't have to go that route if you don't want to. I mean, that's the way I went, but whatever. But I would say this, there are more and more online programs that are not accredited with the US government, who cares, but
Right.
are taught by good conservative people. There is a place to like, here's some books, write some papers, have some other people besides that one pastor in the church correct your papers, give input. That I think is actually useful. So I think there's a in between place between you and I that I would be open to. Like, do you have to have the formal MDiv? No, but maybe get some certificates, kind of like
Right.
you've done in your trade profession.
Right.
I took an online systematic course. I took an online introduction to Greek course.
Right.
That would be helpful. But like in seminary, my preaching courses, my pastoral care courses were terrible
Right.
because they're all theoretical. It'd be much better to have actually the older pastor like, hey, come along with me on a visit. Or like one of the best things that happened to me as a young pastor, the senior pastor let me sit in and listen to a marriage counseling session
Right.
and learning by example. Because I mean, that was amazing. Because I'm like, I
Mhm.
have no idea what I'm doing. And you're 27 years old and you're giving marital advice.
Right.
That's exciting.
Right.
The other thing, though, the one when I went, I had a question I never thought of before.
Mm.
When was the first schools created for the training of ministers?
Oh,
And I Wikipedia'd it. And not surprising, it comes after Constantine, but one of the first references is from 527 in Spain, in Toledo, that there was the beginning of cathedral schools, where these schools would be attached to a bishop. The bishop, the senior pastor in the area, would have authority and training over the schools, but the schools would train future clergy.
mhm.
And I like that. There's formal education. I like formal education, but it's also controlled by the church. Now,
Right.
obviously, I'm assuming in the first, second, the first century and so on and so forth, it's just localized teaching.
Right.
But also, to be fair, in the first century, there's also a universal nature of the church. Again, pointing out Apollos, received training from Paul, received training. I already forgot their names.
Priscilla and
The husband
Aquila.
and wife team. Thank you.
Yep.
Ugh. Yay, old brain not working.
Time to
Um,
retire.
yeah. Well, hey, as you pointed out, I'm over 50 or 55,
Right.
so by Levite standards, I'm
Yep.
out.
You're done.
I'm done. Yeah.
Yep. No,
So,
I'm not against formalized training. And again, even
yeah,
if you break it
yeah,
down, and I'm not against formalized training with anything, because even if you do, self-taught, nobody's really self-taught. I mean, some things you kind of can be, but
yeah.
even an apprenticeship is a system of formalized training, a good apprenticeship, because you will be learning from somebody who learned from somebody who learned from somebody, so on and so forth. It's been distilled down, it's been refined. When you take that out, or you institutionalize training, you end up with an academy in one form or another. So obviously, I'm not against that in concept or even in execution. We had talked about missions before on this, where Is it the responsibility of every individual congregation to do missions or to do
Right.
outreach? No.
Right. Yeah.
But this is one of those advantages of denominations. You pool resources because maybe within 6 local churches, you have one qualified missionary,
Yep.
and that one congregation can't support him.
Yep.
So the other 5 pool resources to support that one. So the same thing with education. You know, wouldn't it be wonderful, as we said before, how wonderful it would be to raise up your own pastors within your own church? Wouldn't it be great also to formally educate them? But you, as one congregation, may not have the resources to do that. And so within a local denomination, if you will, an association or a fellowship of churches, you pool resources, you formalize an education system. Look, these, if you will, crudely put, make your own certification, right?
Yeah.
We want you're a qualified elder, and we think you would be great to be our next pastor, but you should go under some system of formalized education. And to your point, I do agree, someone outside of that congregation should probably have input into your teaching and training and education. Wouldn't it be great if you had 4 or 5 churches that came together
Yep.
and put together a formalized education structure that anyone in those congregations, and then, outside, and what you've done is you've now created another academy, if you will. And this happens all the time. For example,
Yeah.
even to this
Yeah.
point,
Yeah.
a very good online Greek and Hebrew
Yeah.
certification course is the product of what began as a local group of churches. I think in Kentucky, they
Yep.
put together this, and then they just formalized, published it, and you can take their course online for Greek and for Hebrew. So I think it's a beautiful thing. I'm not against formalized education. But more to that point, I am against the how do I put this? I'm against the mandating of one type of approved educational structure. You have to have an MDiv, right? If you do
Yeah.
have it, that's
I'm okay with
great,
that.
right? To
I'm
say
okay
that
with
you
that.
have to, that I have an issue, because again, this gets into anything. Are you now burdening someone morally outside of Scripture? Now,
Yeah.
if you
Because
want to have, as a congregation or as a denomination, you have your own standards, fine, you accept that going in, right? You accept that they, in their freedom, have set
yep.
this as a standard, and you
Yep.
submit to that.
Yep.
But I'm not Presbyterian. I don't have to submit to that thinking, nor am I going to. I don't agree with it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
I love it. It's good for them. There is a great,
and to
there's
be
a
fair,
wisdom to it, but
w-
I'm not going to say
we're in
everybody has to do that.
we're in agreement.
Yes.
But even the Presbyterians allow some freedom because the biblical standard is let the man be tested. And
Right.
so even the place, because like, well, even if you have an MDiv, you still get tested. I mean, I've known people who have gone through and got the MDiv from the official Westminster, seminaries of all Presbyterianism, and they're like, okay, you've passed your academic degree, you ain't qualified.
Right.
You're theologically off the rocker, or you lack the ability of a pastor. Sorry, no, you're not qualified to be a pastor here.
Right.
So they can be tested. But I agree with you. But this happens rarely. But it's like, okay, you have no formal education, but you're one of those freaky people who can do self-motivation or or taken classes online. Because like, I mean, I've known people who do not have even a college education but have spent decades in the word, and they would run circles around most MDiv people.
Right.
I mean, let alone graduates from Yale or Harvard or something like that,
Uh-huh.
which are usually heretics.
How's
So
that gender
we're not
studies
too
doing for
far.
you?
What?
How's that gender studies doing for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're not too far apart here. But the key
Right.
thing is you have to be tested. And I think
Yes.
we both agree the church has to have the final authority.
Yes.
There is something just off on a little trivia tangent, and this shows you the beauty of it and also the danger of it. Um, The King's School, Canterbury, is one of the oldest schools in existence, continuous
Yes.
existence. It was founded in 597 AD to teach men scripture, and it's been going for 1,427 years.
Nice.
Now, currently, the headmaster is a woman, and the head chaplain's a woman, and they're all about diversity.
Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
there's that.
Yep.
They've given up the ghost.
Yep.
But also, there's something beautiful about that in the bigger picture, though. They're
Right. That it still exists.
yeah,
Sure.
yeah,
Well, I mean, and the same is said, and I think you made that point, and I don't remember which one came first, but it's one of like, why was Yale formed? Because Harvard went liberal.
yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, and now look at them both. So it's one of those, it's one, why does Rhode Island exist? Because nobody liked the Quakers.
Yeah.
So,
or the Baptists.
or
Baptist.
is Rhode Island is Rhode Island Baptist? I mean,
Roger Williams wasn't Roger
most
Williams?
of New England's nothing anymore in that.
Oh no, they're all heathen. There's
I know,
something, but
yes,
it's
they
bad.
are. I even complained about that total trivial when we were up at Old Sturbridge Village when we went and visited. You go into the meeting house and they make this big deal out of the historical, I don't know, contribution made by the Quakers, and you start looking at the Quakers, and I'm like, they were heretics that got excommunicated from all of the colonies. Why are you celebrating them? Oh, because they had diversity. They were like your OG DEI group, and I'm like, oh my goodness. But anyway.
Yeah. Well,
Yes.
no, I was on a Boston trip, and it was your typical bus they're driving around.
Yep.
And the tour guide, was a wild-haired woman, made reference to the Puritans. I started cheering, and she paused, like she didn't know what to do because she was going to make fun of them. And then went by some statue of some Anabaptist heretic who was executed in Boston. I was like,
Yep.
yay!
Yay! As it
Well,
should be.
Well, no, but on that story, she kept on coming back. They first banished her, said, "Look, you are teaching things contrary to the faith, and you're a woman, you shouldn't be teaching. Go away."
Yep.
And she kept on going back, and so it's like, okay, if you're just going to be that obstinate,
Right.
but Roger Williams, wasn't he a Baptist?
I don't know. I don't know the history of the Baptist Church.
And you're a Baptist.
I'm not a Baptist. And if I was, I'm sure I still wouldn't know the history of the Baptist Church. Sick burn. Although to be fair, that's not unique. Most Christians don't know the history of the Christian church. So
oh yeah, American Christians would, church history begins with my conversion.
Right. It's not I'm just picking on Baptists.
Yeah. Well, they're fun to pick on. But we've
they have a
gone
much
over.
shorter, and there's no excuse. They have a shorter history than the rest of us. So it should be easier to learn. They haven't been around for as long.
Yeah, Roger Williams and John Clark became founders of the Baptist faith in America. So,
oh, okay. Were they excommunicated from the colonies?
Yeah, they were thrown out. They were thrown out, and they wandered off to Rhode Island.
We're gonna find our own place.
Which you do in America, but anyways,
pioneers.
This was, I think, very helpful. I'm forging ahead. I mean, I obviously got to talk to the elders. We have hopefully decades to figure this out, and see what the Lord does.
Mm-hmm.
But I think how we do it currently is dumb. And so
yes.
I'm gonna keep on going down this road. So any closing thoughts, my friend?
No, it is dumb. It is.
Closing thoughts. It's dumb. And
it
episode.
Is dumb. No, I think it was good. Yeah, don't the church isn't a corporation, and also don't be presumptuous. And that's my advice.
Yep. Well, thank you for this conversation. It was actually very helpful, and it's a great way to work things out. Again, iron sharpening iron.
Right.
Good way to educate folks and oneself.
Yep.
So thank you for listening out there in internet land, and we will, by the Lord's grace, hopefully will return.
Yes. Take care.